For the animal shall not be measured by men. In a world older and more complete than ours, they move finished and complete, gifted with extensions of the senses we have lost or never attained, living by voices we shall never hear. This quote is by Henry Benson. As I walk here on our pristine deserted beach with crystal clear water, I can't but think of another stunning place where the Brumbies roam free. Here a few familiar faces for you to enjoy. This little video is dedicated to our wild horses, to the memory of Paleface and his family, and all the wildlife that perished in the Kosciuszko National Park wildfires in 2019-20, and to all the Brumbies of the Kosciuszko National Park, the Victorian High Country, the Barmah Forest Brumbies, the Guy Fawkes National Park Brumbies, and to the memory of the Gari Brumbies, or Fraser Island Brumbies. Many of these that I mentioned, of these magnificent horses, perished by the hand of man. I recall a time many years ago when we were camping at Fraser Island, or Gari. My daughter was still little, and early in the morning when there was this, fog and mist, and I got out of the tent and I looked around, and there on this beautiful patch of green grass was a mob of Brumbies. They were all laying down, and some were still sleeping, some were awake, and it was just a magnificent sight. I think one was actually standing and sort of guarding. After a little while they all got up and disappeared into the bush, and I will never forget that sight. As I'm recording this video, a bit of a, call it conflict, call it debate, some would call it war, it depends on the way of thinking, I guess. But this debate is taking place in the about Kosciuszko National Park and its Brumbies. A conflict between the New South Wales government together with the National Park Wildlife Services, who have now closed the park for 7 months for the so-called feral animal pest control, and the local and broader community who tirelessly advocate for the lives of the iconic heritage Brumbies of Kosciuszko National Park. For up to 200 years, the Brumbies co-inhabit this stunning environment together with many other endemic, native, and even introduced species. I myself am quite proud to have the opportunity, or have had the opportunity, to give a home to a rescued Brumby from Kosciuszko National Park and a Brumby from the Victorian High Country. They are with us since 2016, part of a herd of 9 horses who are also rescues and roam free on our land. The photos by Di Turner show some of them, and let's see if you can spot the Brumbies. For this video I also used images because I don't live in the Snowies, and some of you might think, well, woman, why are you making this video then when you are not part of the locals and so on? But I think every little voice counts, so hence this video. And I used photos from Snowy, with the permission of Michelle Brown and Ian Brown, by Snowy Brumby Photography. And I would like to thank you, Michelle, for the permission to use some of the photos. And photos by Dean Marsland. Thank you, Dean, also for giving your permission as well. And Carol Hancock and other people who shared some of the photographs from the recent rally in defense of the Brumbies. There is a wealth of information and photographic evidence on pages like the Brumby Action Group, driven by Marilyn Nuske, and many other groups who advocate for the Brumbies. This evidence contradicts the narrative the New South Wales government and Kosciuszko National Parks used to justify the reintroduction of cruel and barbaric aerial shooting of these iconic heritage Brumbies. The shooting started in November 2023 and will continue until October this year. It is said that over 500 Brumbies have already met their deaths by being shot. The reasoning the New South Wales Environment Minister resorts to is based on a flawed report by Dr. Stuart Cairns, who estimates that there are between 14,000 to 22,000 Brumbies in the Kosciuszko National Park. This is purely an assumption, I think, based on an excessive extrapolation of the actual numbers he has cited. And here I would like to mention Claire Galea, who is a highly qualified biostatistician and reviewed that report. I also had a look at it, but I'm not a biostatistician. And so in Claire's words, it says the following. The survey methodology contains significant flaws that put in question the counting of wild horses and the population estimates. Insufficient numbers of wild horses were seen to apply statistical modeling techniques to estimate populations. And she uses an example where the values from surveys conducted in 2014 and 2019 were combined together as insufficient clusters were seen, and population estimates done from this one single value, which means that population estimates over time are fundamentally flawed. So what they did, because they didn't have enough clusters to actually do a valid survey in 2014 and 2019, they pretty much lumped the two together and made one estimate or one count, which that speaks for itself. And as the University of St. Andrews, who reviewed the work, says, estimation of population trends over time is difficult based on this methodology. So it's definitely not one single piece of evidence to rely on, which the government does. And in response to the claim that there is overwhelming scientific evidence that the Brumbies are causing damage, well, the scientists and academics on the Kosciuszko National Park Scientific Advisory Panel and the former Independent Technical Reference Group states that there is a lack of independent and peer-reviewed research on horse impacts, and there are still significant knowledge gaps of horse impacts on the park. The ITRG confirmed this because they could not refer to any established density-damage relationship and lack evidence on which to deduce the form of this relationship for horses in the Kosciuszko National Park. As for the claims of the alleged impact of the Brumbies on the decline in the population of, for example, the broad-toothed rat, the northern corroboree frog, or the she-oak skink and other species, well, there is some research by K. Green and Menkhorst et al., who attribute the significant decline of the broad-toothed rat to fox and cat predation, fire impact, and competition from other rodents. Another factor is the earliest snow thaw on two separate occasions within the previous, it's more than 13 years now, where the population fell to about 34% and has not increased above that point. This was stated in the Threatened Species Scientific Committee Advice Report in 2016. I don't think there was any mention of Brumbies. There is, however, one recent research paper that indicates some indirect impact of Brumbies on the broad-toothed rat population, and that is only due to the rat apparently created shorter runways where they can sort of hide among the taller grasses with the horses present. But this also applies to other species of rats, not only the broad-toothed rats. So it is not clear. But the paper also clearly states that there was a much higher vegetation density in the area where the Brumbies were present, and that much peer-reviewed research needs to be undertaken in relation to this, which means that's a positive impact actually of the Brumbies. As far as the northern corroboree frog decline is attributed to the infection by amphibian chytrid causing chytridiomycosis. It's a bit of a tongue breaker. And it's listed as a key threatening process under the Threatened Species Conservation Act. And again, a more recent paper where scientists were looking into the reason for the decline of the southern corroboree frog concluded that these reasons are currently largely unknown. So all in all, my personal take from this is that every species has the right to live and thrive. Also, all species will and do have some impact as well as benefits for the environment and habitats they occupy. Research singling out the impact of one species only, in this case the Brumbies, can rarely be accurate. Such research sometimes verges on being biased and unethical by focusing on what we call just negative impact and ignoring the benefits of these species for the environment. This is virtually a very narrow kind of keyhole perspective. In contrast to claim about alleged damage done by horses, and aside from the ample photographic evidence by locals to the contrary, ecologist Craig Downer says, quote, "In the world of nature, horses are top-notch humus creators and intact seed dispensers. They are valuable gardeners in their natural habitat. They practice patchiness of grazing that leaves islands to set seed, and they heal the wounds of erosion and toxic pollution, and in many other ways restore the biodiversity, and with it life's resilience that too often an inconsiderate humanity has taken away. The horses do all this, if so allowed. Though they do not have the same deep evolutionary roots in Australia as do the marsupial mammals like kangaroos, their roots are quite deep on Earth, and they have compatibility lived alongside marsupials in South America and elsewhere for millions of years. They can harmoniously adapt and coexist with more deeply native Australian fauna and flora. We people just have to give them the chance to show us how it's done, rather than negatively prejudging them. During this era of global warming, it's crucially important to recognize the critical life-saving value of Brumbies in mitigating and even preventing catastrophic wildfires. And I need not to remind you of how devastating these have recently been. Their post-gastric digestive system permits them to survive off of drier, coarser vegetation without overtaxing their metabolism, and their great mobility permits them to reach steep, rocky and remote places where fires often start, but where they can eliminate excessive vegetation. Precisely this dry vegetation provides the tinder that makes possible destructive wildfire that a heating atmosphere is exacerbating. Many of Australia's human-altered ecosystems need the horses as natural gardeners to heal and become balanced and functional again. In his recommendations, Craig Crowner calls for the immediate prohibition of shooting of Brumbies in Alpine, Bogong, Barmah, Kosciuszko National Parks. He calls for abandoning plans to remove all Brumbies, instead to manage for genetically viable, ecologically integrated and long-term sustainable populations that are allowed to self-stabilize their numbers through the conscientious implementation of a reserve design, which obviously he knows more about that than national parks or Penny Sharp. He also calls for a serious consideration of constructing a log and pole triangular shaped fences that exclude horses from certain more pristine natural habitats, as this works well in other areas of the world and still allows other animals to pass through. And then, of course, he speaks also about that Brumbies should be considered holistically as integral components of many of the ecosystems they inhabit, not arbitrarily treated as misfits, especially when facts reveal they benefit plants and animals, soils and aquifers, which, just to explain, is a body of rock and or sediment that holds groundwater and the community of life as a whole. So you've got the proven benefits, then strong social and cultural values associated with Brumbies as treasured presences and a living heritage should not be belittled or ignored. Independent ethical professional studies should differentiate impacts to the ecosystem that are caused by the various species present, including deer, pigs, rabbits, foxes, wild dogs, domestic cattle and sheep and Brumbies, among other species brought in by Europeans since 1788 and the first fleet of colonizers. So he says actually that he has assessed that Brumbies are being unfairly targeted for blame, while many of the other species are being ignored or let off quite lightly as to their impact. He also speaks about that Brumbies should be honoured. Their benefits to the environment should be honoured when plainly proven, and that observations, factual in-field measurements, methodologies employed, photographs, videos and other means of analysis should not be interpreted in a deliberately biased manner and should not be filtered and distorted, as we sort of seem to see it, in order to discredit the Brumbies. It is critically important that a truly objective team of qualified investigators be brought in, perhaps from outside Australia. And if trapping or removal of Brumbies would be decided to be justified in certain areas, this should not occur during the breeding and foaling season for humane reasons. And also increased support for rehoming of Brumbies should be given to rehomers. So that's end of Craig Danner's recommendations. You can see the whole transcript to this video in the information section, so there is probably more written than I'll be talking about here, and you can access this when you go to the information section. What we humans, in our immense arrogance and disconnectedness from nature, fail to recognize, in my opinion, is that nature is not static. It is dynamic, ever-changing, evolving and adapting to challenges and even adversity posed by nature itself. And I will mention human impact later on in this video. Our governments completely fail to see the bigger picture, the interconnectedness of all organisms, native or introduced, and their interactions, exchanges and relationships. And they have these knee-jerk reactions where if there seems to be a problem, or there seems to be, and it's a concocted problem, it's not even real, they just go and eliminate an entire population of some species. Here I would like to quote Dr. Erik Lundgren, an ecologist in Sweden's Aarhus University who specializes in unseen and feral ecologies. He is also so he actually specializes in, introduced all what we call feral. I have a problem with that word, but anyway, ecologies. He is also a wildlife biologist who spent his career pushing against the idea that you can simply kill your way to a balanced ecosystem. Dr. Lundgren talks about quite a few examples of gross mismanagement by heavy-handed human practices. And here is just one of them, okay? And it speaks about Macquarie Island in the Pacific or Southern Ocean, which is Australian managed. And there was a feral cat overpopulation at one stage. The cats were blamed for eating the chicks and eggs of native and migratory birds. They removed, and now quote Erik Lundgren, they removed the cats, which led to the overpopulation of rats that also fed on the eggs of the chicks of the seabirds. They eliminated the rats, which led to rabbit population exploding and completely denuding the place. They finally removed the rabbits, but then the jaguars, which is a seabird, began predating on the chicks of other seabirds, leading to a similar mortality rate as with the cats and the rats and the rabbits. So what's the appreciable benefit? You have just created a bunch of piles of dead bodies. There we go. And there were also quite some losses, as far as I know, of seabirds who scavenged on the carcasses of baited rabbits. So they killed the rabbits by baiting, and some of the scavenging seabirds, there were quite some large populations of them who were also fell victim to secondary poisoning. So we are talking here about redemptive violence, I think, in conservation, which seems to be, and again, quote Erik Lundgren, he says, I think a lot of energy behind killing comes from, as my PhD advisor put it, us externalizing our own guilt onto the animals. And in the case of Kosciuszko National Park, the Brumbies. So our own guilt about policies, that sort of systems, human impact and so on, we just externalize it and blame it on the Brumbies. Which brings us to the human impact on the environment, namely Kosciuszko National Park. Up to recent days, more than 500 horses have been killed by aerial shooting, including, and I believe that, don't quote me on that, but a foal or young horse being allegedly shot about 18 times. Another mare found with a gunshot and shattered leg lying near a road. And then, of course, photographs of animals being shot in foaling season or with foals at foot, chased by helicopters, shot in the neck, gut, legs, throat, jaws, mares aborting their fetuses while dying. Some dying slow deaths by bleeding internally, drowning in their own blood, thrashing around. I would like to direct my questions to the Environment Minister, to Sue Higgins from the Greens, National Parks and Wildlife, the RSPCA, and the vet who reportedly deemed these as humane deaths. Please look at the carnage. This is what you intended to continue doing for the next 7 months. As far as dumping poison, the 1080 poison, which is virtually outlawed in the USA since 1972 and banned in almost every country except Australia and New Zealand, Another of your humane strategies for the so-called pest control. While some information by the poison-friendly veterinarians or manufacturers minimize the distress of the poisoned animals and the danger of secondary poisoning, the World League for Protection of Animals describes general symptoms as restlessness, hyperexcitability, incontinence, diarrhea, bouts of screaming, tyrannic seizures, sometimes front feet clasped together, clenched or used to scratch the wall. The animals then lie on the ground, kick or pedal with their front legs, and sometimes squeal, crawl around and claw at objects. It seems similar to some symptoms of rabies, doesn't it? Then they collapse, dying slowly with white foam coming from their mouths and nostrils. This applies, for example, to wallabies and other animals, of course, wild dogs, foxes, and so on. And the Deakin University has done a research into dogs who ingested the poison by mistake, the bait, or secondary poisoning, and the horrendous deaths they went through. And all the owners of these dogs are now speaking out against the 1080 poison. Just because it's out of sight and we don't see the animals dying, it doesn't mean that it's humane, RSPCA. Just calling on you. Which, you know, brings us to a bit of duplicity here. So while reintroducing and pushing the aerial shooting of the Brumbies after a 20-year moratorium, and that moratorium resulted from the Guy Fawkes debacle, where around 600 horses have been shot from the air, and the RSPCA filed charges of about 226 or 225 acts of animal cruelty. Now the following is happening under the pretext of protecting the fragile environment of the Kosciuszko National Park. Currently, the 20-year ban on aerial shooting of the Brumbies has now been lifted, and this is the result. So have a look at that. So according to the Department of Primary Industries New South Wales, improper carcass disposal can have significant impacts on environmental, human and animal health. Poor carcass disposal can result in contamination of soil, groundwater and waterways. Access to poorly disposed carcasses can also allow for significant disease spread through scavengers, mosquitoes and vermin. Carcass disposal should occur as soon as possible after the animal has died. End of quote. Does this indicate that these requirements are being observed here? And here are some photos of horse trails. Horses usually move in a single file, and once they created a track, they use it over many years, maybe decades, maybe even centuries if allowed, and if the conditions don't change, or if conditions allow. Other native animals, even humans, then make use of these tracks as well. Here's some comparison with man-made tracks. So you can look at some bike tracks, four-wheel drive tracks, roads, and some other projects as well. Like, for example, the Snowy Hydro 2 project, where they plan to excavate, 7 million cubic meters of earth and dump waste in the Kosciuszko National Park. Or the final master plan of the 40-year project of developing Kosciuszko National Park, including resorts and adventure park, etc. The plan actually allows development in areas of high biodiversity if regulations are respected and compassion is exercised. What do regulations and compassion actually mean in this context, and how will they be observed and exercised? That's my question. From a broader perspective, Brumbies are being massacred to protect the environment, yet logging is rife and the habitat of koalas is being destroyed as we speak, or the spotted gum logging by the forestry, which would endanger the swift parrot. Suddenly destruction of habitat. Oh, I forgot to mention the silver, lead and copper mine in Loo as well. So here we go. Suddenly the destruction of habitat, release of carbon dioxide from the log trees, or the well-being of the koalas, which are endemic to Australia, doesn't seem to be the issue. Not to mention the commercial hunting of kangaroos in the Central West, and the clubbing and decapitating of the joeys. According to the Daily Telegraph in 2009, there were about 25,000 joeys clubbed and decapitated and clubbed to death. Doesn't that put us sort of on the same kind of level like the Faroe Islands for the annual grind of the pilot whales, or Canada for clubbing baby seals to death for commercial purposes, or Japan for killing thousands of dolphins in their practices? It's the same thing, different animal, isn't it? So here we go. I think the quota for the wildlife trade management plan in New South Wales between 22 and 26 is about 1,850,228 kangaroos to be killed for commercial purposes. So how many clubbed and decapitated joeys will that make? Just a question. I am not a whataboutist, as sort of a certain group of people seems to label people who offer a bit of a wider perspective on things and not just a keyhole perspective. But what I tried is to just highlight the issues and a bit of hypocrisy that is going on here. According to the CSIRO, the biggest driver of animal extinction is land clearing, habitat degradation, and pressures from cats, foxes, and other animals such as deer. Habitat fragmentation due to roads, infrastructure, urbanization, and the habitat edge effect is another major driver. So actually urbanization is one of the factors that actually attracts wild cats and foxes into the kind of edge habitat where they congregate more and where they have more options for scavenging and so on. So actually larger numbers will be congregated there, and urbanization encourages this. With the development in Kosciuszko National Park, this will also be a significant factor, especially if development will occur in close vicinity to core habitats with high biodiversity. And here I'd like to point out that it would be a good idea to map out those core habitats if it hasn't been done so already. Thus, Minister Sharp and Sue Higgins is killing the Brumbies, your version of externalizing your own guilt onto other animals, a way of ticking some of the boxes required by your portfolio as the Environment Minister and the representative of the Greens. A lot of atrocities committed on sentient beings happen under the umbrella of law and legality. As my philosophy professor once said, law without legitimacy and legality without conscience gives birth to people like Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele. And in Nazi Germany, they also acted within the law and legality. They were just bereft of conscience. And so here my question: when you are no longer in politics and you will be no longer relevant in this regard, what would you like to be remembered for? What would your legacy be? This or this? And I would like to conclude here with a quote by Pat Fisher, Gooniyandi traditional owner, who says, "Brumbies do not belong to us. They belong to the land. They are teachers of natural ways. They tell us what the seasons will be like. When the dry times are coming, they find water in the dry riverbeds with their hoofs, water that brings life to the cattle, native animals and birds. They are now part of our country. They reflect its health. They deserve the same care and respect due to all in creation. Allow them the vast open spaces. Allow them the land to run free. Honor them for what they are."